facilitate this panel. We have some excellent speakers. And I know that we've been running out of the room with discussion, so you don't need to listen to me anymore. Let me first welcome our first panelist, Dr. Philippe Billon, who is online with us. There, you can see his smiling face there. And he should be able to hear us in the room, maybe not when he's screened. Oh yeah, he can see me right there. And he'll be running his first presentation. So Philippe, please, over to you. And just so you all know, I'm going to do the first 3 panelists. We're going to have 5 minutes for directed Q&A. We're going to do 2 more panelists, and then we're going to do a stretch break, and then we're going to have the overall discussion. So I wanted to break it up accordingly. So Philippe, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'll be brief. I think we've got 8 minutes each. So it's a paper I've been working on with Nick Middeldorp. We're very much at the beginning of it. It's, it's really motivated by the conference itself. And so many of the ideas are quite tentative. So the paper is entitled Towards a Green Peace, Environmental Defenders as Peace-Building Actors in Post-Conflict Societies. So we start with, of course, the concept of environmental and land defenders. Many of you are familiar with it. It's people who are taking peaceful action to protect environmental land or land rights, whether in their own personal capacity or professionally. Here we mostly focus on environmental defenders understood as people from traditional agrarian communities who are facing harmful projects of different types. So the main dilemma is that on one hand, we see and can easily imagine environmental defenders are seeking to support peaceful, sustainable modes of living, traditional types of agricultures, etc. And they're trying at the same time to carving out those kind of peaceful territories of life. And I'll come back to that concept in a moment. On the other hand, however, and especially from the perspective of the government, environmental defenders are very much understood as kind of people who are opposing some forms of development that the state is and corporation very much in favor of, and they enter frequently into conflict with extractivist development models and entrenched war economies, especially illicit economies like illegal mining or illicit crop growing. And so as such, they're seen as creating all these spots of conflictuality throughout the territory. And so the question is essentially, are defenders also environmental peace builders? In what ways? What are their practices? What challenges are they facing? And how can the government and corporations interact with them in ways that will be more favorable to a long-term peace and a positive peace? So what are the defenders trying to achieve? Well, very often they're trying to defend the rights of their communities and territory to be at peace on their own term. And that's often where there is a problem. And by that, they're seeking not only the absence of armed conflicts, but also the absence of different forms of what they see as violence against the land and its people. And they generally, as I said, trying to support modes of living that do not bring harm to their socio-natural environment. So they are in defense of territorios de vida, or territories of life, and they generally trying to do so through assertions of autonomy, or at least securing an FP consent right. And generally, they are trying to bring about a peace for and within the community, as well as beyond. And by that, I mean not only the people outside the community, but also what they consider as the non-human part of the territory and the broader sense of community. So there's been a number of concepts associated with it, including peace with the non-human, post-specism, buen vivir. And so in general, what we see is many of these communities have an assertion of relational ontology between humans and the territories they inhabit. So the territory is a living entity, and they want to protect that. So in the literature, we find a lot of these things in practice too, and in the streets as well. Of course, as I mentioned, territorios de vida has been the kind of concept that has circulated the most in Latin America, and it has kind of spread throughout the world. We see more older forms through peace communities, for example, as the community of San Jose de Apartado in Colombia. Generally, we've been acquainted to the idea also through traditional extractive reserves, such as wild rubber tapping in Brazil, and very broadly, these ideas of traditional indigenous agrarian practices, or in environmental studies, the term working landscapes. Many of these sites also incorporate sacred locations and sacred functions or species, are seen as ecosystem sustaining life in general. So how do defenders relate to peace process and post-conflict concepts? Well, many of the defenders, unfortunately, have been considered by governments and corporations as seditious, or at least as populations and territories to be controlled. As such, they've been frequently victims or sometimes instruments of armed conflicts. When I say instruments, it's in particular through the recruitment by paramilitaries, guerrilla units, etc. And the peace processes open up political space for these defenders, so they can advance their projects through more open and mainstream politics, so that's on the positive side. Yet at the same time, they often frequently open territories to extractive industries, thus threatening defenders and risking renewed conflicts and re-victimization. So as I explained, the defenders seek to pursue peace on their own terms, and as a consequence, they are often targeted or criminalized by the state, corporate entities, and non-state armed groups on both sides, on the right as much as on the left. When these communities have been in places where there is especially leftist activities, we often have seen red tagging, as in the case of the Philippines, where many environmental defenders have been killed as supposed communists. So we can see that there are multiple tensions between political and economic opportunities or threats and the risk of renewed divisions and return to increased conflict and different forms of violence. So the paper will look at a number of case studies. For the moment, I just have time to touch upon the case of the NASA, the Gorda Indígena in southwest Colombia, in the departments of Huila and the Cauca. So they call themselves the Kihuetegna, so caretakers of the land. They use non-violence defense of the territory and assertions of the autonomy. This is mostly visible through the community watch levels and patrols and checkpoints. And they tend to assume many functions, including emergency response in case of humanitarian crisis or natural disasters. Technically, they are unarmed. They use their bodies as well as their numbers, so coming en masse and essentially swarming, if you want, intruders, and in particular paramilitaries, etc., that could come, or people who want to squat, or illegal miners that enter the territory, etc. Most importantly, however, is not those kind of intervention, but the platform that they provide in reinforcing a collective identity and care for the territory. So there are specific activities that we could identify as environmental peace building type activities, so that children's education through land, flora and fauna, and ways of thinking and making sustainable livelihoods. They're organizing community assemblies where people are informed and encouraged not to engage in harmful activities such as illicit crop mining and agribusinesses. They led sometimes community initiatives to eradicate illicit crops. They promote a form of autonomy that nonetheless does not try to push the state and all sorts of state support, but selectively type of engaging with the state, in particular for educational and livelihood opportunities and environmental activities. They bring people into the fold through organizing rotating job, cleaning the rivers, and do all these types of things that can be seen as environmentally positive, or on the contrary, trying to provide alternative to environmentally harmful activities. They seek to acquire more land, both through legal activation as well as land conflicts with monoculture plantation. So they really see a kind of struggle for land as also a form of liberation of Mother and Earth. And so they see that also environmental peace building. And they try to sometimes provide initiatives to through water provision, electricity provision, micro-hydro, etc., to try to preempt the need for environmentally more damaging large-scale projects. So when we look at the case of the NASA, we see some positive elements, and the paper will dwell on that, but we also see many failures, unfortunately, in the peace building process, as we all know through the people who've been with impacts, and Colombia has been a country that's provided a lot of focus for many people at impacts. There's been a lot of failure in the peace process. As colleagues like Irene Vélez Torres has mentioned, there's been, for example, ineffective coca replacement programs. About 20% of the families still continue to grow coca in NASA territories. There's been a prioritization of large business interests over small-scale farming, which has led to recurrent demands. Here we see images of clashes between Notre people and the sugar plantation La Emperatriz. There's been no inclusive land reforms, and as a result, there's been continued structural inequalities and marginalization, as well as unmet needs and aspiration. And also, and this is really a focus of the paper, because Nick, who spent nearly 3 years there now full-time, really sees an inability of the indigenous movement to provide alternatives to the war economy and extractive schemes. And that's the crux of the problem. And that, of course, has led to increased divisions within our communities between people who support those relational ontologies with the territory and families who want to make do or aspire to ir adelante, progress a little bit in life. So I'll provide some basic conclusions. Defenders are, we think, environmental peace builders through the defense of territories of life. They're opposing, not only through the opposition to projects of death, but many other activities. However, post-conflict transitions undermine these kinds of bottom-up environmental peace building, in part because neoliberal economic reconstruction, often promoting extractive and export-oriented land-based projects. The discourses and practices of defenders are often violently opposed by the state, corporation, and illegal armed groups, seeing the defense of territories of life as a threat to state sovereignty, economic recovery and integration, and corporate or criminal profitability. And the peace process does need to be more grounded by defenders rather than imposed on defenders. And there are a number of ideas that have been put forward, such as in Colombia, the idea of territorial peace. So to capture some of these ideas, we don't have time to come back to that at the moment, but it did not work in part because of power relations and economic incentives that remain the same. So thank you very much. I'm probably a bit beyond time. Sorry for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. And as I said, and for those of you who just came in, we'll have 2 more speakers and then we'll open up for a round of questions for our first 3 speakers. So if I may please welcome Drew Marcantonio from the University of Notre Dame. I missed an O-N in there, didn't I?
Italian.
Marcantonio.
Even though I am.
Okay, so if you want to advance your slides, let's see, yeah. So, so go to here.
As I was doing that, so I'm Drew Marcantonio. I'm from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, involved with a bunch of different programs there. The Peace Accord Matrix program, which I'll talk a little bit about here, which is the motivation for the paper that I'm going to present, which fortunately segues very well with Philippe's work in Colombia, because PAM is a formal monitoring body for the Colombian peace agreement. We're now going to be the monitoring body for the Mindanao agreement and a couple other things. But the Colombian component was the onus for this work. There it is. The onus for this work, because I was asked to consult with them and think about the environmental provisions with the Colombian agreement and how we might think about the environment in the peace agreement and its implementation. What we initially found is that while there are many hints at it and what have you, the provisions for the environment are pretty light, other than rural reform and through the Pedet and Penes programs. So rural land reform, which you'll see dominate some of the literature that I'm going to present that we found in our systematic literature review. But I got to that because we said, okay, so are these provisions and are they being implemented or not? So this last year, we launched the first formal report on an environmental agreement, analyzing every environmental provision and whether it was implemented or not for Colombia, with only about a 30% implementation rate at a stage 1. And then what we say stage 3 is complete with none. Yes.
Excuse me, can you speak a little bit?
A little slower.
Oh,
Yeah, I haven't
just
like my students.
a little bit.
I'm a lot, so I'm supposed to stay here. I think the cameras.
And sorry to
Anyways.
interrupt, but we can't see the presentation on Zoom. Sarah, is that possible to fix that one?
Could you see Philippe's?
Yeah, we saw Philippe's,
Okay.
but we don't see the presentation. We see the screen, the computer screensaver, looks like.
Well, the short story on it is that in Colombia, while there's a lot of environmental connections in the agreement, it's not being implemented. So think, okay, how is the environment in other peace agreements? Well, if you look at interstate peace agreements, which the Peace Accord Matrix monitors, only about 1/3 of all agreements have any sort of environmental provisions included in them, and they're generally non-specific. And if you look at all peace agreements, looking through the PAX database, there's a lot of mention of the environment, but very little specific provisions around it. So I said, well, okay, what does the peer-reviewed literature say then on the environment in formal peace agreements? If we're not seeing it implemented, if we know it's continuously a problem, UNEP put out a report saying 60% of all conflicts that are affiliated with environmental issues, if there's not provisions, then they will relapse back to conflict. So it's an important issue, as we know. I'm sure we have a selection bias on all of us thinking that because we're here at NPACS, right? Environmental Peacebuilding Association. So challenges broadly, they kind of need this. We have, as many have talked about already, this growing challenge of conflict internationally. Intrastate, interstate, one-sided violence doesn't matter. It's all increasing, both the number of deaths associated with it and the number of conflicts in general. The rest to the next one. Current, oh, for some reason it's not letting me.
It should now. Is that
Oh, will it?
Mhm.
Oh, good. But, and I'm going to breeze through some of this real quick. Essentially, the other part saying that, yes, we have growing conflict and we have growing environmental issues that are directly assaulting human health. This tends to be my general shtick of things, what I call environmental violence, human-produced vectors through toxic pollution and climate change emissions. That's why I have this little overlap. What I wanted to see then further is this included in peace agreements, because I would try to make the argument that it needs to be more included if it's not currently, because of the connection between environmental issues. So we looked at the Sierra Leonean Civil War. I worked in Sierra Leone for several years looking at illegal mining operations, so a place I'm quite familiar with. If you look at the number of deaths that happened during the Civil War, 10-year period, about 60,000 people. So you put that over average, it's 5,400 people. If you look at annual human-produced toxic pollution deaths in the country, so this is in the post-conflict context, which there were very few provisions in the Loma Agreement about pollution and environmental issues. Yes, there was a sharing agreement about certain resources, particularly diamonds, but it was not on environmental remediation, as an example. So if you look today, there we go. There's about 12,000 deaths a year from toxic pollution emissions, mostly associated with industry, foreign industry for that matter. And well, yeah, more than half that's about from mining alone. Okay. So the argument that I'm trying to make by pointing that out is that yes, we have the violent conflict, but if we don't include environmental factors in peace accords after to mediate what might happen in the peace dividend with foreign companies that tend to take advantage of a newly stabilized environment. Yes, we need economic development. That needs to also be included in the peace agreement, which is the next shtick after this article, is the lack of business incorporation into peace agreements, private industry. Even though, for example, in the Colombian agreement, the business community was one of those most involved in the negotiation, the word business or private entities does not make it into the formal agreement at all. Okay, I'm going to skip the DRC ones. It's the same thing. So we did a literature review, systematic literature review, using three major repositories of peer-reviewed research. Why peer-reviewed journal articles? Because that tends to be the touchstone of academia, and I wanted to see what academics are putting forward in this space. The literature, gray literature, and for example, like Carl Brooks' edited volume on this topic is not included in this. That's mostly dominated by practitioners and folks who are really doing the work. I want to see academia doing its role in research to supplement or support that work. So we did a systematic literature that included peace agreement in terms of environment, or peace accord in environment, and then a whole bunch of different environmental variables. So that's why you see the ands, right? In these literatures over the last 10 years. So that was the 10 years after Carl and friends edited volume that had 30 chapters, all on a related topic. So what did we end up with? I don't want to take a guess how many articles in total. You see, there's like, even as we start winnowing it down, it gets to that. How many were actually on the environment and peace agreements? 24. 24. In the last 10 years. This is a chart just showing you the time periods in which it was covered. These three were Israel-Palestine, the Oslo Accords, and then you see after Colombian peace agreement. And Colombia dominated with about 12 articles of the 24 in this space. So some basic findings about these agreements. Mostly were case studies, but single case studies. Only 2 articles were cross-comparative analysis between agreements. So we have most of this being singular case studies without reference to others being put in articulation with. If you look at the environmental media that's covered, land dominates, and most of those again were Colombia because the rural land reform provisions were such a big component of that agreement and an important part, even if not effectively implemented, as Philippe has pointed out quite well, as we found in our own analyses. Water, only 20% of the agreements, or 20% of the conversations on this, I should say, in the articles. Oil and minerals is mostly about Sudan. But these are the environmental media that are mostly represented, whereas toxic pollution, contamination, et cetera, was very minimally represented in those conversations or in the literature. And then I'll say natural resource management, which tends to dominate environmental peace building as opposed to environmental protection, which is different. Yeah, pollution contamination mentioned somewhere, and climate change a little bit. Okay, I'm almost done. Sorry. So just some emerging trends from this is that 14 of the 24 articles talk about provisions for environmental programs, but again, 10 of those were dominated by Colombia. Okay, there we are. Again, brought up reform, and a lot of it is natural resource management, which is control access or distribution of resources, as opposed to the pollution that might come out from the extraction of them, as an example. Not a single one talked about provisions for pollution mitigation, as an example. Just the use and access of a resource. Sustainable development in its mention or development at all. So economic components associated with only 4 of the 24. And then the specificity was only talked in one article. So when we say specificity, that is about what needs to be specified in the provision. One of the main issues you have with provisions and peace agreements is actually being able to implement it. Because if you don't have specifics tied into it, what are the standards? Who's going to do it? Where does the budget come from? Which is my last line funding. We know that it doesn't happen. These are the practical considerations of peace agreement development. And then funding was not talked about any of it, which is a critical component, especially when we think about, for example, the ongoing conflicts in Gaza, Ukraine, where we know like who's going to pay for this? How is it going to be funded? When we're literally talking billions and billions of dollars in damage and remediation costs. So some final conclusions. One is there's a dearth of research coming from the academic community. That's a big problem. Just looking for a research agenda. Important questions are arising about how to negotiate this, and this tends to be where and why the environment or the specificity is not included because of the political process of negotiating peace agreements. And as you include more specifics, people get wrapped around the axle on what that means and how you're actually going to implement that. And that's some of the work that challenges that we're finding now. Through PAM, we advise on several different peace negotiations that are ongoing at the moment. And as we're injecting the information, we're finding that the groups at the table, if we say we need more specifics, it can be inhibiting to getting to yes, to ending the conflict. And so that's one of the biggest challenges and why that's not, or why I conjecture that it's missing any more empirical evidence for that. It's anecdotal. And then minimal focus on sustainable development, integration, toxic considerations. I make that point in some of my other work. Implications, we have a weak empirical basis, even though this is most conflicts end by peace agreements. And so we need to understand how to do this and how to do it better. And the research community needs to pick up the slack and support, because that's one thing that we're able to do. That should be able to do. And then with environmental conflicts on the rise, the onus for that and environmental challenges, so conflicts and environmental challenges on the rise, only more of a reason that we need to be better at this. Provide the empirical evidence base to inform effective decision making. So that's it.
Thank you, Arava. And finally, I'd like to welcome Sandra Valenzuela, the CEO of WWF Colombia. We'll be sure to play the video.
Okay, thank you very much. As Sarah said, I'm Sandra Valenzuela, the CEO of WWF Colombia, and I'm going to share more as a practitioner view what we have been learning, how to really promote the implementation of the peace agreement in Colombia, mainly in the arc of deforestation of the Amazon and the surrounding areas with the Orinoco and savannas landscape and the Andean region that is three type of landscape interrelated between each other that has been kind of the core of the negotiations, but also the heart of one of the biggest groups, the FARC. And how we are learning to do it, what we call about a conservation agreement. So putting the environment and the livelihoods as a center to really implement the peace agreement.
It's the video now, right? Yes. Okay, so the video, it's hiding behind the. Yeah.
So part of the fragility of the country is that besides we signed a couple peace agreements so far. So far, one in the 90s with the M19. The second process failed between the 88 and 2001. The third failed in terms of the social constituency support to vote for yes. So the government has to pass a law in the Congress to vote to approve the peace agreement as a law. And right now we are in 4 different processes for a different type of groups, rightist, illegal, new emergent, illegal economies, and so on and so forth. So at the end, we are not in a post-conflict situation, to be honest, but what we have been trying to drive in terms of working in a very biodiverse area because of the 3 ecosystems, but with victims, not only at the territory, but also with the communities, is under the framework of the law of the peace agreement signed in 2017 to implement core and small conservation agreements towards the implementation of the umbrella of the agreement. So that is part of our storytelling. But at the same time, if we look this journey of conflict, of multiple dimensions of conflict, there are certain things that they are kind of that remember us, that is always natural resources, illegal use around, or fighting or natural resources. As you were saying, like land, water, illegal mining, illegal forestry, and so on and so forth. So in the different moments of the dimension of the conflict, natural resource access has been a driving point. So what, as an organization, as a conservation organization with an inclusive conservation approach, we need to understand what is happening with the natural resource access, with the illegalities, and how that is driving the different type of the conflict and the different type of dimension to really have this understanding, or at least a small understanding about all these routes, to be able to really promote a better living for the local communities. So this, again, we have the same portion of the territory with other type of access of land use grabbing and illegal land use grabbing. And again, we have like these routes of illegal mining or illegal natural resources that again comes to the same area. And we can go so on and so forth, the land minings and so on. So this is critical to understand the high conservation areas with communities, and can be ethnic communities, can be farmers, and badly called landless or peasant communities. We prefer to call them farmers as a way to work more closely with them with a negative connotation. So I'm not going to go for the details of the drivers of the conflict, because what we need to show is that the victims, they are not only humans, but also is considered the territory, and that is thanks to the peace agreement negotiations. And so we can say that in the same region, we have indigenous reserves, but we have also the farmers' negotiations for their own reserves and their own way of recognition of the rights. And kind of in the short term, we expect to have the recognition of the land as well. And here we have the correlation between the different momentums of the peace agreement and the implementation of the peace agreement with the deforestation plan. So you can see that there are linkages between them. So how we are being approaching in terms of understanding the conflict, using the conflict sensitivity assessment, working with Peace Nexus, and also working, as I said, with the umbrella of the agreement to have policy engagement with the municipality, with the states or the departments in terms of policy making towards national policy making and vice versa, kind of promoting the ESCASU support adoption for the country, but also in the region, territorial planning with the department or the state, and different type of judiciary action using the rule of law that we have. But based on capacity building, we are working with the communities to work what we call conservation agreements. That, as I said, is the focal point to really being able to implement the peace agreement using generation information. We have to take decision with accurate information on the hands of the communities, on the hands of the public institutionality, and WWF as a convener of those. The dialogue training to understand the conflict interests that they are on the table, and also to implement economic and transformative nature-based solutions in terms of providing livelihoods as part of the implementation of the accord, and different type of financial sustainability for a positive environment, social, and financial impact. So saying that is the conditionality to really have environmental justice, social justice, and at the end, the core element is the environmental peace building and peacekeeping. Because we are using the environment, the conservation as a reduction of the vulnerability of the communities, but the way to really have an innovative approach in terms of the understanding of the needs and the conflict interests beside the political turmoil, and understand each other to be able to address the different causes. So these are core elements that we have been learning by doing in terms of understanding all the drivers of the land tenure, because all of us, we want a tenure, if it's in a city, in a rural area, and why not of the local communities that they overlap with the protected areas or they are in the buffer zone. And addressing the nexus of the different type of conflict or the different geopolitics of the conflict, or how the conflict changes over the time. So we need to really understand, and that is the conflict sensitivity assessment, the recognition of tension between the public institutions, the national, the regional, the border institutions, because the illegality cross-border that we have in the Amazon, and the inclusive conservation is not only to recognize the legal rights because of the Constitution, but the needs to be recognized different type of rights, and to really promote social and environmental justice. To using a socio-ecological approach to convene the parties, and using what we call peace building with the environment, to understand each other and to provide better livelihoods, rights to have a better livelihoods, different type of voices, to have different type of livelihoods and recognition of rights, and using different type of connectors between the conflicting parties to be able to really implement the peace agreement. And to conclude, so the different type of the conflict, you need to address different ways of agreements, but also to recognize that there are agreements in different type of communities in the way to really convene all them, and not being able to opposite between the different type of agreements. Because as you saw, the territory that we are working is quite huge. So we are promoting agreements here, but they need to understand each other. So we have to convene leaders from the different areas to talk as well to each other. So we promote a better rule of law and an understanding from the different type of communities and interests. Of course, the armed conflict still increase the inequalities of the countries, and each illegal and emerging group that is raising at the moment is increasing the level of the inequalities. But there is a lot of possibilities when you really address with key information, with the grassroots as a way to be part of the peace agreement, that you don't feel only a victim, but you are addressing the devenir of your livelihoods, really taking into consideration the signature, as you were seeing in the video, the agreements with the public authorities in their own region. So the voice of the voiceless has been heard, and we can say that at least we are promoting for a better living and the implementation of the peace agreement. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's take a few minutes. Okay, let's do a 30-second stand up and introduce yourself to your neighbors. So you don't fall asleep, your legs don't fall asleep. Nice to meet you.
Jet lag. I got in yesterday. Now we're agents with direct flight. Like yeah, exactly.
I'm studying in Syria. Turn it over to Dr. Rina Kedem, who is joining us online. And Suleiman, where did you go? He's in here. There you are. Thank you. Suleiman Halasah, her co-author, is also in the room right now. So Rina, please, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Would you like me to share, or we'll just continue this way?
Oh, you know
I'll
what?
just say next.
Yeah, just
It's
say
okay.
next. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It looked fun, the 30 seconds energizer. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I had to cancel last minute. And I'm really thankful to the organizers that could pivot and allow me to present via Zoom. So as Sarah said, I will be presenting on behalf of Dr. Suleiman Halasah. Suleiman, raise your hand so everybody can see who you are. And myself. Suleiman is affiliated with Oxford University, and I'm affiliated with the Hebrew University, and we both also work at the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, which is dedicated to environmental leadership in the Middle East. And we work on many environmental cooperation topics and projects, practices, research, and policy in the Middle East. Today, I will highlight one of the aspects of our shared research with a focus on the role of transboundary environmental cooperation professionals through the case study of Israel and Jordan. I'll just say next. So I'll give a bit of a background. Why is it important to study the role of these professionals in epistemic communities? And I'll give a few highlights about the situation here and some of the results of our study. So literature and practice demonstrates that environmental professionals have immense importance in shaping international environmental policies and plans, for better and for worse, when it comes, for example, to climate change. Environmental professionals also fill in the implementation gaps, which Richard referred to. Agreements sometimes are signed, but most of the time, or unfortunately, the implementation gap is huge. And also when there are no agreements, environmental professionals step in, and sometimes they're the ones who address the needs on the ground of the environmental work per se. The potential outputs, they can become policy entrepreneurs, mitigate environmental externalities, and improve the management of transboundary natural resources. In any case, this is a multifaceted role, and as mentioned, especially important in conflict and post-conflict atmospheres due to high politics. In conflict areas, environment is usually, as all of us, I'm assuming, know, is not seen as high politics and a lot of the time ignored. Next slide, please. And who are we talking about? Who are these transboundary environmental cooperation professionals? We're talking about governmental officials, negotiators, NGO members, scientists and researchers, individuals, entrepreneurs, And again, their role could be informing and leading agreements, policies, programs, and also managing communications, both domestic and cross-border, with everything that has to do with the transboundary cooperation. And again, we're talking about environmentalists that come from all fields and practices. Next, please. We have a known knowledge gap in the literature. On one hand, we know that this role is important. On the other, we know very little about the agency of these professionals. And at the same time, there's also a need to better understand bottom-up transboundary environmental cooperation initiatives and also bottom-up peace building. And specifically here in the Middle East, we know also that they are the main players in this transboundary environmental cooperation in Israel and Jordan specifically. Next. And speaking about the case study here, Jordan and Israel signed a peace agreement in 1994 after fighting in some frontal wars in the past. And we managed to map, in one of my researches, we managed to map over 80 initiatives since the signing of the peace agreement, environmental initiatives. It is a cold peace, it is a volatile peace, as you all can imagine, that goes completely hand in hand with the general politics in the region. There are strong anti-normalizations and critiques, especially in Jordan, and calls, constant calls, even before this current war, to cancel the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. Many take this peace agreement for granted. And at the same time, both of the countries have major environmental challenges, both separately and some of them shared, of course, water and beyond. And these two countries also share unique habitats and natural resources that are cross-border in their nature, such as the Red Sea, the Dead Sea, the Wadi Araba, where both Suleiman and I reside, and more. Next, please. In this research, we did an exploratory research and we used focus groups, participant observations, interviews, surveys, and the majority of data was collected between 2017 and 2022. As you can imagine, this is a case study with a small n. The researchers, both Suleiman and myself, we are also practitioners in the field, so that is a limitation and also an advantage. And the initiatives and researchers, many of them have to remain under the radar, which makes it hard to both pursue answers for surveys and interviews and even map sometimes initiatives themselves. Part of the result of the limitations or just the volatile atmosphere that we work in caused or changes our vocabulary when we use cooperation over peace building because of the political connotation. And that is a whole article and topic by itself, choosing cooperation over peace building, which I won't get into now, but I think a fascinating topic. Next, please. And the process itself entailed looking at the interaction realms. How do the professionals interact with policy, with high politics, and as a community? And also, what are the factors that influence the work of the professionals, the challenges, and also checking one of the main premises of the environmental peace building field, trying to assess how does this shared work in the environmental realm, what impact does it have on the willingness to solve other conflicts or the political conflict in the region? And next, I will highlight some of the results. So most of the professionals have interactions with decision makers. Some of them are actually an address for policymakers to policymakers involve these professionals whenever they need to make decisions around such transboundary cooperation and environmental issues. Most of them, if not all, are interested in increasing such interaction between policy and science. Some of them do not know how. There are few yet significant achievements when it comes to policy, some of them led by EcoPeace Middle East, which are present at NPAC's conference as well. We learned that the peace agreement in terms of high politics opened the door, but did not dictate the work of the professionals. And following Richard's presentation, the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel is actually an extraordinary example of including environmental chapters. Nevertheless, we found that most of the professionals were not even aware of those environmental annexes that are part of the agreement, meaning that they really follow the needs on the ground. Of course, there are contextual factors beyond the control of the experts themselves that shape the success or failure of transboundary conservation. And this impacts the professionals in an asymmetrical way that we will see in a moment. And yet there is, the experts report a positive transformational impact on their attitude through this cooperation. Next slide, please. Most of the cooperation initiatives between Jordan and Israel are informal in their nature, at least the ones that we can map in this specific research. The ones where you see the high bars meaning they have a low political transaction cost, a less risk associated, more science, informing, data exchange, education, etc. Very few initiatives that have actual governmental impact through policies or shared committees. We have a civil organization like EcoPeace, which has offices in Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. Next slide, please. I wanted to ask you the question, but I can't see you, and for sake of time, a lot of people think that funding is the #1 issue, the challenge that the professionals face. In our case, it's definitely the political events and the associated challenges, such as the public opinion and anti-normalization in Jordan. Next, please, Sarah. We know that the political events have an impact on the work of the professionals, but we also wanted to know which political events. Again, this was before the current war. Up to 2022, the ongoing volatile relationship regarding Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, was one of the highest, received the highest reference. You can see the red are the Jordanians experts and the blue are the Israelis. So obviously all of these events have a stronger impact on the Jordanian community, which we knew. And of course, even before this war, the ongoing wars in Gaza. Next slide, please. And regarding the effects of participating in tech projects and leading them, we see high influence. Next slide, please. I'll highlight, again, what's most relevant to the premise of environmental peace building. Through these statements, we try to assess, again, the impact of the involvement of professionals, and in this way, understand the spillover effect of environmental cooperation on peace building, because we assume that environmental cooperation creates peace building, but how do we prove it? It's not immediately translating to peacemaking or agreements. So we asked if participation in tech projects, for example, increased my willingness to find nonviolent solution to political conflict in our region. And you can see an outstanding answer in most of the professionals answered above 3. The highest was from 1 to 5, when 5 is the highest rank. And most of them attested that participation in projects increased knowledge of cultures different than my own, the ability to understand and listen to opinions different than mine. Next slide, please, Sarah. These are just, you can pass, next slide again. This is a table of the results. And I will highlight another finding. This was with community members that did not participate in such tech projects. And we asked them, do you think environmental cooperation between Jordan and Israel can lead to cooperation in other topics as well? And here as well, we have the majority of respondents answering in a positive manner. Next slide, please. So to conclude, we do see that the professionals lead significant transboundary environmental change. They are the main ones who do it in our situation. The work itself has an immense impact on the professionals, and we need to create more avenues to allow professionals to influence policy. And we would like to expand this research to include other contexts in order to highlight the important role and agency of tech professionals. Thank you. And questions will be asked at the end to both Suleiman and myself. And sorry, Sarah, I have to include one very quick reference to the war. I know it's not the place and time to get into it because it's impossible, but I cannot ignore it. So I will only say that there are many organizations and individuals working together during this time to promote a ceasefire and to sustain the existing collaboration and peace building initiatives in the Middle East. The Arava Institute is one of them and is also leading environmental aid and relief efforts in Gaza with Palestinian partners. And if you want to learn more or ask questions or get involved, please contact Suleiman and myself. Thank you.
So much, Rina. And let's please welcome our last